Thank you for joining us today for our TMC seminar. And it's my real pleasure as the co-director of the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative to introduce our speaker for today, Reverend David Finnegan-Hosey. I want to read his bio, and David, you can join us on screen whenever you wish to do so. David Finnegan-Hosey is the author of two books, both of which I'd strongly recommend. One is Christ on the Psych Ward, and another, his second, is called Grace is a Pre-Existing Condition, Faith, Systems, and Mental Health Care. David currently serves as the minister of Bon Air Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the Richmond area, having previously worked in a variety of campus ministry, nonprofit, and congregational settings. He holds an M.Div from Wesley Theological Seminary and a unit of Clinical Pastoral Education from the National Institutes of Health Clinical Center. He's certified by Mental Health First Aid USA to provide initial help to people experiencing depression, anxiety, psychosis, and substance use disorders. In 2011, David was diagnosed with bipolar disorder after a series of psychiatric hospitalizations. He now speaks and writes about the intersections among mental illness, mental health, and faith. And he lives in Richmond with his wife, Lee, their daughter, Layla, and their dog, Penny Lane. I would just say thank you so much for joining us today, David. As many of our students know, we read your book, Christ on the Psych Ward, in one of our courses here at Duke Divinity School, and you've joined us in conversation and really been blessed every time. And I look to you as somebody who's like really one of the leaders in thinking about the connection, especially between faith and mental health. And we're really excited for you to join us today to present on the topic of Stewarding Sacred Stories, a Shared Vocation. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Warren, and to all the fellows, and for the invitation to be here today. And thank you all for being here and being part of this conversation. I think it's one of the most important conversations we're having right now as we think about intersections among our faith and spirituality and mental health and mental wellness. As we try to have those conversations across disciplines, right? And so I'm excited to be here with a group of folks who span from theologians and spiritual care providers and pastors and chaplains to people in the medical professions. It's really wonderful to have these opportunities for us to kind of sit around a virtual, in this case, table together and have these really important conversations. So thank you so much for being here. I want to talk a little bit about story today and about stewarding sacred stories and this idea of story stewardship as a shared image or a shared space for our different career paths. That's kind of a shared vocation, a shared calling that we have, right? That I think the importance of stewarding people's sacred stories as a mode of healing work that crosses some of the professional divisions that are present here today. And so to do that and do that well, I want to tell a little bit of my story. Some of you might be familiar with this if Warren's made you read my book. Thanks for that. Or you've had some other encounter with my work. But I just want to share a little bit of that story and then dive into some ideas around how we can be good and faithful stewards of each other's sacred stories in a way that promotes healing and wholeness. So just to start with a little bit of my own story. I was, as my bio says, diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 2011 after a series of psychiatric hospitalizations, which is a pretty short sentence and nice and clean and clinical, and of course, not actually how it felt at all, or kind of a descriptor of what that experience was like to live from the inside out. I had finished my first year of seminary classes in 2011, and everything had gone quite well from kind of an external objective perspective. And so it was of great confusion to me why it felt like my life was coming apart at the seams. And so that series of psychiatric hospitalizations that was mentioned, it was actually weeks and weeks and months of dealing with this just absolute storm of chaotic emotional confusion that was sort of felt like it was kind of pulling me apart from the inside. I crashed into the summer after that first year of seminary uh, with experiences of isolation, of deep-seated anxiety, of self-harm and suicidal ideation, and really was not sure what to do, where to turn, what might be going on. Right? And eventually, with the help of some friends and the help of the National Suicide Lifeline, which I should just say now has a 3-digit number that can be called to reach it. That's 988. So now if you call 988, that 3-digit number gets you to that National Lifeline. Which, well, it's a state by state, but that number is national. Uh, I got myself, with again the help of some friends and colleagues, to Sibley Hospital in Washington D.C., where I was admitted into the psychiatric unit. This was a first time experience for me, first time being on prescription medications for just about anything, much less for mental health. It was a really scary, kind of confusing experience. I was there for about 2 weeks. They said, it seems like you're stable, seems like you're safe. And I left Sibley, and a few weeks later was back in again, and then back out, and then back in again, and back out, and an outpatient program in there. And all in all, it just generally became quite clear that these short-term interventions were not getting me to a place of stability, to a place of safety, to a place of real healing, right? So I ended up in a longer-term care program out of state, Silver Hill Hospital in New Canaan, Connecticut, and was there for several months. Should put a pin here just to say, right, that that whole story, as painful as it was, as difficult an experience as it was, also each step along there, you can see the ways that my story is also one of a level of privileged access to care resources, right? The fact that I knew people who knew where a good hospital to go was, the fact that I was able to afford that care, to access that care, the fact that there are psychiatric beds available in in an urban area, which is, when I speak to churches in rural areas, often something that's pointed out just is not in existence in any sort of accessible way in more rural churches, right? That kind of access, that kind of ability to get to care, to know about care, is just not the reality that many, many people face in our country or globally. And so, in order to have the big, deep conversation that we need to have about mental health care in this country, we can't just have my story, right? This could be a starting place, it could be a door opening, but it's got to open into a much bigger, wider, deeper set of conversations with a lot more stories than mine. For the vast majority of people in the United States, experiences of mental health crisis often set them on a path to either to incarceration, or to chronic homelessness, or to a revolving door between those two, right? And so we need to be addressing those systemic realities, even as we delve into the personal power of story, and make sure that we're getting a wide range of stories around the table in order to have that whole conversation we need to have about wholeness. So I was at Silver Hill, as I said, for several months. I came back to Washington, D.C., in a bit of a more stable place, not feeling like I was in immediate crisis anymore. And things were just really, really hard for a really long time. And during that time, while I was trying to figure out sort of how to get myself out of bed in the morning and moving, I, was not able to go back to my seminary courses. I needed to stay on medical leave, which was the right decision for me. But also, I think, my seminary, like many others, struggled with knowing how to communicate that kind of thing in a compassionate or in a sensitive way. And during that time, I started working with a group of college students at a nearby university. I'd been intended to start working with them as part of a seminary internship back in the fall, and I'd sort of disappeared right after having met some of the student leaders. So it felt like maybe I owed a little bit of an explanation. And so the time came for me to give a sermon, sort of a trial sermon, right, at one of our Thursday night worship services. And I decided I would talk a little bit about my experiences in the hospital in that sermon. And so I preached on the passage in John's gospel where Jesus calls the disciples friends. And I talked a little bit about the experience of loneliness in the hospital and this idea that maybe if Jesus calls the disciples friends, then maybe Jesus needs friends. And maybe that means that Jesus knows the pain of being lonely. And my hope was that, that it would be at least a passable sermon, and also that it would kind of let students know this is what happened, this is where I've been, and I'm fine, and we're good, and we can get back to the work of ministry that we're supposed to be doing together, which of course isn't what happened, right? What happened instead was that students began coming to me one at a time and saying things like, I really struggle with anxiety and depression, or I have a family member with a really serious mental illness and it's really hard for them, it's really hard for us, or I have a friend or a roommate here at school who is going through a really dark time and I don't know what to do, I don't know what to call it, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to help them. And I wasn't sure if we could talk about it in church. But you talked about it, so I guess we can talk about it. And for me, this was a real revelation, a real apocalypse. Right? This was a moment of sort of my eyes being open to the fact that even this pretty unpracticed way that I had shared a little bit of a story had opened a door that people really needed open to know that it was okay to talk about it, that it is that we can talk about this here. Right, that we can talk about this here in church. And I would say, let's also extend that and think about all of the here's where people aren't sure whether they can talk about it, right? And so this was an experience for me of kind of stumbling into story, of stumbling into the power of story, even a story sort of clumsily and imperfectly told, to create some brave and healing spaces where people are able to share stories and thus share in the healing that can come through that sharing. It's for me become a piece of my calling, right? A piece of my vocation to work with faith communities to think through how do we let people know, how do we communicate that not only can we talk about it here, but actually talking about it here is what here is all about, if wherever here is going to be a space of healing. And by talking about it, I mean mental health and mental health challenges, but I mean actually something a little bit deeper and broader than that, right? Which is just like the frailty and the challenges and the difficult, jagged edges of being a human in a complicated world, right? Can we talk about difficult experiences? Can we talk about experiences of hurt, of shame, of grief, all of which are sort of ways that you could also describe the experiences of mental health challenge and of mental health crisis, right? Can we talk about it here? There's an image that comes to my mind when I think about like an image of a place where we can talk about it, right? That comes from the Gospels. In Mark's Gospel, in the 6th chapter, there's one really quick verse that you can almost zip right by if you're not paying attention. What's happened right before this verse in Mark chapter 6 is that Jesus has gone to his hometown of Nazareth and things have not gone well. He has tried to heal people, he's tried to perform miracles, and he's ended up booted out of his own hometown, right? Not great. Then John the Baptist is executed. Remember that John is Jesus's cousin. They've known each other from the womb, at least according to a different gospel account. Their movements are allied with each other. These are friends. They know each other. He's been killed by the state. Things aren't looking great for the Jesus movement, right? And it's in this context that Jesus sends the disciples out in groups of two to engage in the ministry of preaching the kingdom, of healing, of reaching out and touching the people who are in need in the Galilee. And then they come back to Jesus. And there's this one quick line, Mark 6, Mark 6, verse 30. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. And if you just read that line, you might assume that that was sort of a bragging session, right? The apostles are like, hey, check out all these demons I cast out. Check out all this healing I did. This has been great. Except that we know, right, that Mark has put this in a context where things are actually not looking so good, where Jesus himself has struggled to heal and to perform miracles, where the disciples have, in fact, received some quite bad news, right? And so if the disciples really gathered around Jesus and told him everything they had done and everything they had taught, well, there were probably some pretty difficult stories in the mix, right? Some stories about times when they had failed, some stories about times when they were unable to bring about healing in a situation, some stories about times when they were really afraid, perhaps afraid for their very lives, right? That there were some stories of shame, of guilt, of fear in the mix in this gathering around Jesus to tell him all they had done and taught. After this story in Mark's gospel, what happens next is the feeding of the 5,000. And so from this kind of gathering in and sharing of stories comes this moment of reaching out to feed, to meet the needs of the people around this wider community. And so you have this picture of the church, right? The church before it's even called the church, as a community of people gathered around Jesus, probably with a shared meal, right? Sharing everything, sharing the stories of good that they have seen and of hurt that they have seen, of times when they have felt the grace and the presence of God and times when they have looked hard for it and not been able to see it. And from that community comes a kind of a missional reaching out and sharing of abundance with those around us. We're sharing stories to change the world, right? How do we create those kind of spaces? How do we create places where people feel that they can share all that they have done, all that they have taught and learned, all that they have received and given, all that they have failed at or felt they have failed at? How do we steward sacred stories? I want to give two examples, and I call this the tale of two psychiatrists. And I should say I'm not going to include any identifying details. I'm not trying to criticize or lionize any individuals. These are just two different experiences that I've had that I think help us get at some of what might be some key shared practices in order to create spaces of stewardship of sacred stories. So here's two very different encounters with people in the profession of psychiatry that I've had during this journey with mental health challenges and with bipolar disorder that I had. Right? So here's the first story. I am in the office of a psychiatrist, and I am walking through how my experiences of suicidal ideation have been going over the past several weeks since we have last met. And the psychiatrist stops and asks me what I thought was a good question. He said, does your faith ever help you resist suicidal urges? I thought that was a good question. To which I said, yes, I think it really does. I think my faith is something that I turn to a lot when I am having the experience of it feeling like my brain is trying to kill me. You know? And then the psychiatrist said, yeah, I've had a number of people say that to me over the years, that they might feel like they want to kill themselves, but they would never do that because they're too afraid that they would go to hell. This is not what I meant, right? This is not the landscape of my faith that I turn to when I am feeling those suicidal thoughts and tendencies. In fact, that is for me a kind of a theological framework that I find a bit harmful and toxic. Now, I want to pause here to say, let's approach this conversation with care, right? So, for example, my colleague Rachel Keefe writes in her book, The Life-Saving Church, that we really have to be careful as care providers, particularly she's writing to pastors and chaplains, but you could extend this to any kind of spiritual care provider or care provider who encounters people who might be in mental health crisis, that we have to be careful that we don't dismantle theologies when those theologies are really serving a preventative or a life-saving purpose. For example, if someone were to say to me here in my office at my church, I've been experiencing suicidal thoughts, but I know that I would go to hell if I were to do that, and so I haven't been doing that. If I were to say, well, let's think about the concept of hell and where it comes from and kind of dismantle that theology, right? Then I could potentially be doing quite a bit of harm, right? I'm creating a permission structure for someone to actually engage in suicidal behaviors, which should not be my goal, right? Rachel Keefe's point, right, is that the goal is saving lives. And so if someone holding a theology that I disagree with is helping them prevent themselves from engaging in behaviors that would be harmful or lethal for them, then I've got to kind of set my theological framework aside and say, what can I do to kind of help build up this life-saving safety net around this person? Right? Jessica Koblenz, in her book Dust in the Blood, draws on the work of the ethicist Karen Kilby to talk about how careful theologians and spiritual care providers need to be in approaching the first-person accounts of other people's suffering. Right? That it's not the role of the theologian to invalidate or argue against the meaning making of those suffering. It's not our job to try to impose meaning on someone else's suffering, but rather that the theologian can diversify the widely available resources for first-person theologies of suffering. Dr. Koblenz writes, as I have tried to sort out some of the answers on my own. These answers have resulted in two guiding convictions that shape my theological project. First, that theologians should not impose meaning onto the suffering of others. And second, that theologians have a responsibility to transform the present theological landscape wherein Christian interpretations of suffering typically amount to justifications for suffering and the imposition of meaning onto it. In other words, it's both true that it's not my job to impose meaning on someone else's suffering, and it's true that there have been some tendencies to do that in Christian theological thinking, and so it is the theological's job to maybe provide a more expansive set of options and language for people. My wife, Lee, is a hospital chaplain. The image she uses for this is jiggling the doors of people's theology. And so when someone shares a sort of a piece of their theological framework, she might ask a couple of questions to see if that's something that someone is thinking about, right? Is that a door that's about to pop open? Does everything really happen for a reason? Or is that a door that they are really locked shut right now, that they are relying on us to kind of keep shut because diving into a deconstructive framework right now would not actually be helpful for where they are in their process, in their healing. With all that said, right, here I am sitting in a psychiatrist's office who's asked me a question that's, I think, a good question, right, trying to draw out some of the healing potential of something that he knows is important to me, a framework that I bring to this conversation, my faith, my Christian faith, my dedication to that faith. He's doing a good thing, but he's doing it with a big assumption, right? That he sort of knows what the landscape of that faith looks like and how that might interact with this conversation around suicidality, right? So how do we encourage that good instinct, that good question, without bringing to it a set of assumptions about what that question might mean for something, right? There's a need not only for religious and spiritual literacy in the sense of what do Christians believe about X or what do Muslims believe about Y, but holding space for the complexity and diversity of spirituality and meaning making, which is a tough thing to teach and a thing that cannot be well taught through a series of diagnostic categories or checklists. Right? It requires a little bit of slowing down and a little bit of holding space for some of the complexity of people's sacred stories. So, Tale of Two Psychiatrists, that's the first. Here's the second. I am sitting in a different office, in a different place, and I have just been told that I do not have the major depressive disorder that I had been diagnosed with up until that point, but in fact probably have bipolar disorder, which is a different diagnosis, requires an entirely different set of medications, and is leaving me feeling confused and anxious and like I'm starting all over again after weeks and months of having to tell different care providers, different doctors, different medical practitioners, different social workers, the gory details of my embarrassing personal breakdown, right? And I am confused and I say, how could this be, right? How could it be that I've talked to 6 doctors who said, oh, you have this diagnosis, and now I'm talking to a 7th who says you have this diagnosis. And this psychiatrist pauses and puts their clipboard down on the table and puts their pen down and says, okay, let's pause for a second. Diagnoses are kind of like stories. You are telling me what you are experiencing in your life. And I have a tool, a list of symptoms that match to certain diagnoses. And we're just trying to match up some set of language that I have with the actual story you're telling me in order to get to a treatment plan that gets you to where you want to be, to a more healing story. This really stuck with me, right? I didn't know a ton about mental illness diagnoses before I found myself sitting in these various doctors' offices. I knew a little bit about story and the healing potential of story, right? And this was not only presenting a principle or an idea, right, but it was also a hearing into speech of my own struggle to understand what was going on. So this doctor was able to provide a narrative, literally a narrative framework for me to step into, to be able to share my story and to get to more of a healing space, right? It takes a little more time. It takes a bit of holding complexity, and it takes an ability to both know the tools of your profession and to be able to hold those tools lightly as we try to navigate the real jagged complexity of human experience in general and of human experience of crisis and mental health crisis in particular. Diagnoses are like stories. If that's the case, then many different types of practitioners have the shared vocation of stewarding sacred stories. By sacred, right, I don't just mean religious stories or stories of faith. I mean stories of the soul, stories of the nephesh, the Hebrew word, which comes from the word for throat, right, and is more like the depth of my being, my innermost being, my whole story, the story that emerges from the most inward part of me. it takes time and space and care to open the doorway for those stories to be told. Time and space and care that the US healthcare system, right, is not necessarily very good at providing for. And so I think a lot of this brings us back to a systemic question where I think that there are probably a whole lot of medical practitioners and mental health professionals who would love to have the time and space to do this sort of story stewardship, but feel constrained by the time constraints of their profession that is imposed on them, right, by either insurance, systems of insurance coverage, or by a lack of practitioners leading to an overload in casework, the kind of things that lead to us into conversations on the medical side of things about things like burnout and moral injury. Right. And so just to kind of bring it back and name that I'm not demonizing anyone. I'm not meaning to impugn anyone's kind of vocational call, but there's an invitation here, right, into like, what are the kinds of skills we need to be learning? What are the kind of systems we need to be changing or recreating in order to see this shared vocation across professional lines of hearing into speech people's sacred stories? And so we together, I hope, can create and hold space not only for a story, but for lots of different stories, right? This big, deep, wide conversation about the challenges of stigma and silence, the challenges of inequities and barriers to care, the challenges of systemic barriers to the time and space needed for this kind of caring work. All of this can contribute to the healing, not just of individuals, but I think really of the world. So I just want to end by reading a few verses from a psalm. I started by saying that, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and that's a clean and clinical way of saying it, and a quick way of saying it, and also not particularly in keeping with what the internal experience of such a thing was like. Here's a psalmist, right, writing thousands of years ago, writing long before the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual was ever a twinkle in anyone's eye. And this is Psalm 102, right? Here's an ancient poet, priest, singer trying to express the experience that they're going through as an individual and a communal experience that's shared by their people. Psalm 102 says, "Hear my prayer, O Lord. Let my cry come to you. Do not hide your face from me in the day of my distress. Incline your ear to me. Answer me speedily in the day when I call. For my days pass away like smoke. My bones burn like a furnace. My heart is stricken and withered like grass. I am too wasted to eat my bread. Because of my loud groaning, my bones cling to my skin. I am like an owl of the wilderness, like a little owl of the waste places. I lie awake. I am like a lonely bird on the housetop. All day long, my enemies taunt me. Those who deride me use my name for a curse, for I eat ashes like bread and mingle tears with my drink because of your indignation and anger, for you have lifted me up and thrown me aside. My days are like an evening shadow. I wither away like grass." These first 11 verses of Psalm 102, for me, are a better approximation of the experience of being in the midst of crisis of what we could clinically call bipolar disorder. These capture it better than the diagnostic categories in the DSM. I'm grateful for the DSM. I'm grateful for the tools of the mental health professions that lead me to get to the kind of professional care that I need to make my to help me live the whole and the abundant life that I think I want to live and that I believe that God calls us to live together. But the spiritual landscape of that experience is captured much better by a poet who wrote thousands of years ago, who presented their suffering before God, asking for an intervention, and who shared that language with a spiritual community calling on God together, a place where a spiritual community where it was most certainly okay to talk about it here. Psalm 102 doesn't make a good diagnostic checklist. I'm not necessarily suggesting that you ask your patients whether or not they feel like a lonely bird on the housetop. But how do we create spaces where this sort of experience, this sort of language of experience, language that takes great bravery in the face of pain that can feel inexpressible, can feel beyond or deeper than words? How do we create the space where this kind of speech about suffering can be possible, can be met with care and compassion, and can be stewarded, can be cared for in a way that leads to care, that leads to healing for an individual, for the systems we work within, and for the world beyond our walls? So I'll stop there and would welcome any questions. And thank you again for taking the time to be with us today.
David, thank you so much. This is really helpful and thought-provoking. And I know that there's questions from those in the audience, but while people are thinking of their questions, I would invite you, if you do have a question, to either use the Zoom function to raise your hand, and I'll call on those who are raise their hand in order, and then I would invite you to unmute if you're willing to, and to reach and to speak your question directly to David. If you prefer, also, you can send your question in the chat to the meeting host, and that'll be passed on to me, and then I'll pose it to David. So thank you for your questions. I'll get us started. I have a lot of questions, David, and so I'll ask the first one that comes to mind. I love that, as a psychiatrist, I love the story of the two psychiatrists, and I love especially the story of the second psychiatrist who offered that maybe diagnoses are ways of continuing a story. So I want to ask a specific question about diagnosis. As you know, on college campuses like the one that I sit on right now, it's been increasingly common for over the last 10 years for students both to say that they're more likely to experience things like depression and anxiety, and also that they're more likely to have sought and received treatment for, again, mental health challenges like depression and anxiety. And so it seems like there's both increasing distress and also an increasing spread of people like locating their experience in specifically diagnostic clinical terms. And I just wonder what your thoughts are about that. If diagnoses are ways of telling a story, how might, in a student health context, for example, how might it be really helpful to have these specifically clinical terms like depression, anxiety, maybe bipolar disorder, maybe OCD, ADHD, in the mix, and what might be some challenges or pitfalls of that, if any?
Yeah, thanks, Warren. It's a really great question. Prior to being called here to this congregational setting, a lot of my experience was with campus ministry and being in higher education chaplaincy, right? And so I saw both the sort of the really good thing and the real shadow side of something that's happened over the past couple of decades on college campuses, right? The work of destigmatizing conversations around mental health has been really successful with a younger generation of people who is coming onto college campuses, and that we've broken open that conversation in a way that I think is a really positive thing, right? So more people are talking about it, more people are seeking help, more people are familiar with the language of mental health. This is great, right? This is good stuff. This is what we wanted. There is an inevitable consequence of that, right? That then your need goes up, right? And so when I was in college I graduated in 2007, my college campus didn't have a counseling center, or if it did, there was maybe one part-time person, right? Now college campuses are desperately trying to staff up these counseling centers. I was at Barton College in Wilson, North Carolina, a little Disciples of Christ related school. Before that, I was at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., right? The counseling center at Barton was completely overwhelmed. We couldn't keep up with the demand. The same could be said of Georgetown University. If Georgetown couldn't do it, Barton College wasn't going to be able to do it, right? There's a little bit of a difference in the amount of money that those two schools have access to, let's say. Okay, so the need has far outpaced the ability to provide care, and something else has happened too, which I think your question kind of hints at, Warren, which is increasingly we've sort of swung the pendulum all the way over here to telling faculty, telling student affairs professionals, telling whoever's involved in the lives of students that they got to refer. You got to refer to the mental health professionals when someone's in a mental health crisis. Okay, so we're referring. We have this huge spike in need, but the thing is that we've sort of swung the pendulum a bit too far in one direction, right? Where now we would have people referred to the counseling center because a student came into their professor's office crying, right? And once you sat down and talked to the student a little bit, you found out they had done poorly on an exam, or they had broken up with a significant other, right? These are like human experiences of encountering failure, or of encountering shame, or of encountering, kind of relational grief. What lots of those students need is someone who's had those experiences, which is most of us, right? To sit and listen to them and hear them out, and perhaps share some wisdom, perhaps just ask a couple questions, right? We have had the human experiences of feeling lonely, of feeling scared, of feeling anxious, right? And to kind of completely medicalize or completely pathologize those conversations, it ends us up in a situation where A, we can't possibly keep up with the demand, and B, we're sort of pathologizing any experience of sadness, right, or of guilt, or of grief, or these things that are just core human experiences, right? And so, I think being able to create spaces where we can, where there's sort of a dialogue between the people who are creating spaces in chaplaincy and campus ministry and classrooms, right, and the mental health professionals, and that's really a two-way dialogue, right? I think for a long time, when I wrote Christ on the Psych Ward, one of the needs I saw in this conversation was there's actually like a ton of resources. If you're a pastor and you're like, I don't know what any of these mental health terms mean, there's a lot of like, here is a quick guide to the DSM for pastors, resources out there. But there's maybe not as many resources going back in the other direction, right? Which is, I think, like that first experience with like first psychiatrist kind of opened my eyes to, right? That there hadn't been somebody who kind of sat and talked about, here it's 6 different ways that different Christians think about suffering, right? And what they might be bringing in to your office when they come in with an experience of crisis or need for care. So anyway, I'm giving kind of maybe a long rambling response, right? But I think we do need to sort of shift the pendulum back, not all the way, right, but a little bit of the way back, to think about how are we creating spaces where people are able to share experiences in a way that is healing and not necessarily pathologizing, right? And that, I think, will help support mental well-being on campuses and similar spaces in a way that we just can't provide individualized care for every single student who needs it if we're locked into this one kind of medical mode of thinking about the challenge.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I guess I would ask you what you think about this. It seems to me that we're entering maybe a little bit of a kind of post-therapy era where not that therapy and psychological and psychiatric treatment is going to be in any way going away, but I think we've realized that you can't staff up a campus mental health center in a way that's going to then solve the needs of, say, student mental health. And I think we can't, in the broader mental health care system, we can't hire and create enough clinical systems because I think a lot of the problems are like rooted in disconnection and communities feeling afraid and people feeling like they're being pushed and pushed to produce and to appear in certain ways. And so what does it mean to along with therapy, be focused on the kind of communities that we're building, which seems to me a really important role for the church and for, people who are, maybe inside, but also outside of the medical system per se.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think like the church is a great little laboratory of I cannot successfully we had NAMI of Central Virginia came to do a couple of workshops at our church to do kind of like a mental health 101 workshop, right? We had great turnout. I mean, fantastic. We had like 50 people. Amazing. Probably about 30 of those were members or kind of close connected to church. About 20 were folks from other churches or from the community. Awesome. Like, right, huge success. I've got 325 members, right? 30 of them coming to the Mental Health 101 workshop is a huge, I'm like, praise Jesus. Right?
Yeah, you can retire now. Yes. Yeah.
Right. But like, that's 30 people, right? There is probably no world in which I can get forget 325, say all 200 of my active members to go through a Mental Health 101 workshop. But a whole lot of those people are doing things that are great for communal wellness and mental, emotional, spiritual resilience. They're doing things like visiting people when they're in the hospital, visiting people who are in care facilities or assisted living facilities, bringing meals to people when they're going through a tough time, having gatherings at the church where people build relationship and community and fellowship. They're doing these things not because somebody has told them, hey, mental health is really important, right? But because they think it's just what the church does. But all of those things, right, are huge for people who are going through some sort of mental health challenge, which in one way or another is all of us at some point or another, right? One of the reasons I like the terminology of mental health challenge, right, is it's expansive. Some of us have a diagnosis, some of us have a chronic or acute condition that fits within the diagnostic category of the DSM, but all of us go through it, right? At some point in our lives, right? So the church actually has like these practices that it knows how to do, hope that it knows how to do, or at least are in its collective memory bank, right? That are actually like, if we then think through the lens of kind of communal mental wellness, it's exactly the kind of stuff we need to be doing, right? And so it's how do we make sure that those types of activities are sort of safe and open and available for people with mental health challenges is a good question. But gathering together, building relationship, singing together, eating meals together, these are praying for each other, lifting up each other, in a public setting. These are things churches know how to do or have in their collective memories how to do. And so I'll keep doing the Mental Health 101 workshop over here, right?
Yeah.
But then over here, there's this deep well of communal spiritual memory, that the question is, how do we activate that and kind of encourage and support what's already happening? That's really important.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, at the VA where I work, we work hard to gather veterans into therapy groups, and that's really powerful. But how much more the experience of eating together in a place where a community belongs and where there's a possibility for shared life. I think it's all really important. I keep looking to see if there's hands raised or questions in the chat. I do see here one. So one of our participants says this presentation was out. Oh, excuse me. This is actually to me. The presentation is outstanding. Could we share it with other students? And we will gladly share the recording. So thank you for that. Others who have questions about for David, there's plenty of time to ask. I'll offer one more as we go, and would invite any of you to again raise your hand or to post a question in the chat. It has to do with, I think, Kilby's concern about not being too directive to those who are suffering, especially not giving theological explanations or answers in ways that kind of overrides people's own ability to just simply be in the state of suffering. And I as a clinician, I struggle with that because on one hand, of course, like we want to provide space and validation and not be too directive and not to overwrite people's stories. On the other hand, I think there are ways in which like we a lot of what particular forms of therapy are in any of the cognitive behavioral therapies are offer like ways of making sense of like how certain kinds of experiences form, maybe some things that might be helpful in changing them, and so they are kind of guides for there are stories that are offered to give people a path to go forward, as was the diagnosis that the second psychiatrist offered. So I guess I wonder, advice for, there's a lot of clinicians in the room. What advice would you offer clinicians about like when to offer particular stories and when simply to allow people to feel what they feel and to
Yeah. So I think a couple of thoughts come to mind. I think one, I really appreciate where Dr. Koblentz
Mhm.
goes with her chapter where she's referencing Kilby, which is where she kind of comes to is like, I don't want to impose meaning on someone else's suffering, but I do want to expand the language options available to them, right? I want to
Mhm.
here's so that we can say here's a number of different understandings. Do any of these kind of help, right? Do any of these help give language to what you're experiencing? It's if not, okay, let's take those. Right, we can take those off the table, right? But so offering, I think, not only options but an expansion of options. And then I mean, I'm biased, right, because she's my wife, but I just love like Lee's image of jiggling the doorknob really
Love
helps
that
me a
too.
lot, right? Because
Yeah.
it's this sense of like you can kind of you sort of test the waters, right? Of like, is there something here that someone is wrestling with and exploring, or is there something here that someone is holding on to, like it's their anchor in the storm, right? I remember
Mhm.
when I was at NIH as doing my clinical pastoral internship, right? And I was talking to this family who the families at the Children's Inn at NIH, they have kids who have been diagnosed with 1 in 1 million, 1 in 10 million
Mhm.
genetic condition, right? Um, they've got no answers. Nobody has. I mean, it's really scary situation. And I'm talking to this couple that like they are from a reformed background where like this is God's will, right? This is God's will for their family, and they it was not that belief was not causing them suffering. It was causing me suffering. I was like, how can you think this? In my mind, I'm like, how can you think this is God's will that your child would suffer like
Mhm.
this? For them,
Mhm.
that was their safe harbor in the absolute storm of trying to care for their kid and trying to love their kid and trying to, go to all these different doctors. I mean, there's just this absolute
Yeah.
um, maelstrom that they're in the midst of,
Mhm.
and like, you know what? That's that's what they're holding on to in that. It is not my job to get in there and mess with it, right? And so you've got to kind of develop, I think, a sense of like when is one thing true, and when do you hear someone say, "Yeah, I know everything happens for a reason," but like,
Yeah.
okay, what? Tell me about that but, right? Like, right? What's going on in that when you say that, right? Um,
Yeah.
and again, that doesn't it's not a checklist, right? It's not it's that you do have to develop a little bit of just uh, an artistry in doing that. Yeah.
Yeah. I love the image of the chaplain and frankly the all of us as the possibility of being a doorknob jiggler.
Yeah.
All credit to your wife in saying that. Yeah. I think we have one last question. It's from Aaron Klink. Aaron, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
I think you just kind of touched on one part of this, and I'm a chaplain as well. But how do you think about how your experience helped you or made it difficult for you to interact with a chaplain? As far as how do you hear the gospel in the midst of depression, and how do you think chaplains can help offer hope when hope is hard to find because of, a medical condition or diagnosis. I know I often struggle with how best to be a chaplain to those struggling with, mental health challenges.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Aaron. It's a great question. I think as sort of cliched as the response is, the idea of ministry of presence is really important. And what I'll just say is that from the other side of it really matters. There are relatively few things that I remember people saying to me while I was in the hospital, but I really remember that people were there, right? And so there are times when we preach the gospel, and there are times when we just sort of hold the gospel for people, right? Because they can't hold hope for themselves right now. We are presence in the experience of absence, so that at some point someone can find their way back to that experience of presence, right? And I just think that this is how we see God work at many places in the scripture, right? That in the Psalms, that at the cross, God does not always show up and say, "Don't worry, everything's actually fine," right? But the affirmation that God is present in suffering is kind of an affirmation that God is able to be in a place where God's presence is being doubted or questioned or not felt, right? The example of this I always give, right, is like people would come visit me in the hospital, and I would talk about how lonely I was, right? And like my poor friends who like took the X2 bus to come see me at Sibley, right, probably wanted to smack me upside the head. Like, how can you say you're alone? I came all this way to see you, right? Like objectively, I wasn't alone, but I felt like I was. So what wasn't helpful? What wasn't helpful was trying to convince me, no, David, your perception of this is wrong. You are in fact not alone. What was really helpful was people who could sit with that, or who could say that sounds really hard, or that sounds really painful. Who weren't trying to like talk me into the experience of presence, but who by holding that experience of absence were able to, at a deep level that I couldn't access just then and there, right, were able to be present with me. So I think that's when we see Jesus coming into the depths of human experience, right? Just to use Christian language, we see Jesus going to the cross. We hear Jesus crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" We're watching God enter into that depth of human experience, and not debating with it, but just being in it, right? Becoming a part of it. And our wild theological claim, right, is that has a salvific effect, that has a healing effect, even when all evidence to the contrary would seem to suggest that it does not, right? So I think that's kind of the frame I would hold that in.
David, thank you. Thank you for your talk. Thank you for the answers to these questions. You've given us a lot to think about, and it's really rich. So thank you for being with us today.